It started with a sentence that should never have mattered. One ordinary moment in a room where nothing dramatic was supposed to happen. A kid was asked a simple question, the kind adults toss out without thinking, and she answered honestly. She said her mom was a Navy SEAL. Not loudly, not for attention, just a matter-of-fact response, like saying your parent works late or wears a uniform. The kind of detail kids share without understanding how strange it might sound to grown-ups who already think they know everything. The room shifted immediately, not because the statement was dangerous or disrespectful, but because it challenged what the adults had already decided was possible. They looked at her, then at each other, and that quiet disbelief turned into something sharper. Smiles curled into smirks. Someone let out a laugh that wasn't kind. The kind of laugh that says, "You really expect us to believe that?" And instead of asking a follow-up question or moving on, they leaned into it. They made the choice to treat a child's words like a joke. That's how harmless statements turn into problems. Not because of what's said, but because of how people with power decide to react. No one paused to think, maybe this kid is telling the truth. No one considered that there are careers most people never encounter, lives lived quietly, families who don't broadcast what they do. It was easier to assume she was lying. Easier to label her as dramatic. Easier to turn the moment into a lesson they thought she needed. They started asking questions that weren't really questions. Where's your proof? What does your mom really do? You mean like in the movies? Each one was meant to poke holes, not gather facts. The girl tried to answer, but the tone of the room had already changed. Her words were being weighed not for accuracy, but for entertainment. Adults chuckled. One shook their head. Another said something about kids making things up these days. What could have ended in seconds turned into a spotlight she never asked for. What made it worse was how small the statement actually was. She didn't claim heroics. She didn't brag. She didn't ask for special treatment. She just answered the question she was given. The reaction said more about the listeners than the speaker. It revealed how quickly people dismiss what doesn't fit their expectations, especially when it comes from someone younger, smaller, easier to overpower. The harmless statement became a trigger because it threatened their sense of control. In their minds, they were the authority in the room. They decided what was believable and what wasn't. And when a child contradicted that without meaning to, it felt like defiance. So they reframed her honesty as attitude, as lying, as something that needed to be corrected publicly. They convinced themselves they were doing the right thing. No one asked why a kid would lie about something so specific. No one wondered why she didn't sound rehearsed or smug. They didn't notice that she wasn't enjoying the attention. They missed the small signs, the way her shoulders stiffened, the way her voice got quieter, the way she kept glancing at the door like she was waiting for someone. Because once adults decide a story is fake, they stop listening for truth. This is how stories like this always begin. Not with yelling or chaos, but with dismissal. With a moment that could have passed unnoticed if someone had simply nodded and moved on. A single sentence that became a problem only because the people in charge chose to turn it into one. They assumed the worst instead of giving the benefit of the doubt. They forgot that kids don't invent entire lives just to impress strangers. By the time anyone realized how far it had gone, the room was already locked into its version of events. A harmless statement had been twisted into a challenge. A simple answer became evidence, in their minds, of disrespect. And the girl, who had done nothing but speak, was now standing alone in a space that no longer felt safe, no longer felt neutral, no longer felt like a place where the truth mattered more than who was allowed to tell it once the room decided the girl was lying. Authority stopped being about responsibility and turned into something else entirely. The adults in charge didn't step in to calm things down or redirect the conversation. Instead, they leaned on their positions to press harder. Titles, rules, and roles became tools, not safeguards. What should have been a neutral environment suddenly felt stacked against one person who had no power to push back. They spoke over her, not to her. Every attempt she made to explain herself was interrupted, corrected, or dismissed before it could fully land. One adult reminded her where she was and who she was talking to. Another referenced policies and expectations, as if those had anything to do with whether her mother's job was real. Authority was used to shut down questions rather than ask better ones. The message was clear. Their word carried weight, and hers did not. Instead of listening, they framed the situation as discipline. They said they were teaching her a lesson about honesty, respect, and appropriate behavior. But no one paused to confirm whether dishonesty had actually occurred. They didn't verify. They didn't seek context. They assumed intent and then punished based on that assumption. This is how authority gets misused, when certainty replaces curiosity and control replaces care. What made it more disturbing was how quickly the group dynamic formed. Once one adult took a hard stance, others followed. No one wanted to be the one to challenge a colleague. No one wanted to look soft or unsure. So they backed each other up, reinforcing the narrative that the girl was at fault. Each nod, each agreeing comment, tightened the circle around her. Authority became collective, making it harder to question and easier to abuse. They began treating her emotions as evidence against her. When her voice shook, they called it guilt. When she got quiet, they called it defiance. When she tried to stand her ground, they labeled it attitude. Everything she did was filtered through their conclusion, and nothing she said could change it. Authority, in that moment, was not about fairness. It was about maintaining dominance and saving face. There was a moment when someone could have stopped it. An adult could have said, "Let's slow down," or maybe we don't have all the information. But that would have required admitting uncertainty, and authority figures often fear that more than being wrong. So they doubled down. They raised their voices. They used formal language to make the situation feel official and irreversible. The more pressure they applied, the more justified they felt. They reminded her of consequences, of rules broken, of what happens when kids lie to adults. These warnings were delivered with the confidence of people who believe they were unquestionably correct. No one considered the imbalance of power at play. A child, isolated and outnumbered, being lectured by people who controlled the environment, the rules, and the outcome. Authority wasn't protecting her. It was closing in. What they didn't realize was that by refusing to listen, they were exposing their own insecurity. True authority doesn't need to intimidate to be respected. It doesn't need to embarrass or overpower. But in that room, authority was fragile. It couldn't handle the possibility of being wrong, especially in front of a child. So it chose force over humility. The adults told themselves they were maintaining order. They said they were preventing disruption. But the disruption had come from them, not her. From their decision to escalate instead of de-escalate. From their refusal to treat a child's voice as something worth hearing. Authority, when misused, doesn't look like chaos at first. It looks calm, controlled, and confident, even as it causes harm. By the time the situation reached its breaking point, authority had already failed in its most basic duty. It had stopped serving the people it was meant to protect and started serving itself. The girl wasn't being corrected or guided. She was being silenced. And the room, filled with people who believed they were in charge, had become a place where power mattered more than truth. The humiliation didn't happen all at once. It built slowly, layer by layer, until the girl realized everyone in the room was watching her for the wrong reasons. What started as a response to a question turned into a performance she never agreed to give. I stayed on her longer than they should have. Voices dropped into that tone adults use when they think they're being patient, but are really being condescending. She wasn't just being corrected anymore. She was being displayed. Someone repeated her words out loud, exaggerating them, making them sound ridiculous. Another adult smirked and asked her to say it again, louder this time. The room reacted with quiet laughter, the kind that pretends to be harmless but lands like a slap. Each reaction told her the same thing. This isn't about understanding you. This is about showing everyone else what happens when you step out of line. They didn't pull her aside. They didn't lower their voices. They didn't protect her privacy. Everything was done in front of others, as if the audience was part of the lesson. Public humiliation works best when witnesses are present. It sends a message not just to the person being targeted, but to everyone watching. Don't do what she did. Don't speak up. Don't challenge what we believe. The girl felt the heat in her face first. That flush of embarrassment that comes when you realize there's no way to escape the moment. She looked around, hoping to catch a sympathetic glance, some sign that someone thought this had gone too far. But most people avoided her eyes. Some looked uncomfortable. Others looked entertained. Silence filled the gaps where someone should have spoken up. They corrected her posture, told her to stand still, told her to stop fidgeting. Every small movement was pointed out, as if her body itself was doing something wrong. When she tried to explain again, they cut her off and reminded her that lying wasn't acceptable. The word liar hung in the air, heavier each time it was implied, even if it wasn't always said outright. What made it worse was how calm they seemed. No yelling, no obvious anger, just measured voices and practiced authority. That calmness made the humiliation feel intentional, controlled, like they knew exactly what they were doing. Like this was a routine they'd performed before. The kind of humiliation that doesn't leave visible marks, but stays with you long after the room empties. Kids learn quickly in moments like this. She learned that honesty doesn't always protect you, that adults don't always listen, that being confident in your truth can still lead to punishment if it makes the wrong people uncomfortable. She learned how fast a room can turn against you, and how alone you can feel even when you're surrounded. They asked rhetorical questions designed to get laughs. Do you think this is a movie? Do you think we're stupid? Each one drew another reaction from the room. The girl shrank a little more with every comment. Her voice grew softer, not because she felt unsure, but because humiliation has a way of stealing volume from you. It convinces you that being quiet might make you invisible. No one considered how old she was. No one adjusted their approach for the fact that she was still a child. They treated her like an example, not a person. Public humiliation strips away individuality. It turns someone into a warning sign. This is what happens if you step out of line. This is what happens if you make us question ourselves. Even when she stopped responding, they kept going. Silence was treated as defiance instead of distress. They filled the quiet with more commentary, more assumptions, more judgment. At no point did they ask how she felt. At no point did they consider that they might be causing real harm. The goal wasn't resolution. It was submission. The room felt smaller as the attention stayed fixed on her. Time stretched. Seconds felt heavy. This is the part people don't see when they talk about discipline or correction. The internal collapse. The way shame settles in your chest and makes you feel exposed and powerless at the same time. The way it teaches you to doubt your own voice. Public humiliation doesn't end when the moment does. It follows you out of the room, into your thoughts, into the way you speak the next time you're asked a question. It lingers in the fear of being wrong, of being laughed at, of being singled out again. And in that moment, as she stood there with every eye on her, the lesson being taught had nothing to do with truth and everything to do with control. The shift didn't announce itself. There was no dramatic interruption at first, no raised voice demanding attention. It started with a pause that felt different from the ones before, the kind that makes people look up without knowing why. Conversation slowed. Someone near the door stopped talking mid-sentence. The confidence in the room wavered, just slightly, like a signal dropping out. Then a sound cut through the quiet. Footsteps. Not rushed, not hesitant. Steady, purposeful. The girl noticed it before anyone else did. Her head lifted instinctively. Eyes moving toward the doorway she'd kept glancing at the whole time. Her posture changed, just enough to be noticeable. She wasn't shrinking anymore. She was bracing. When the door opened, the energy in the room broke. The person who stepped inside didn't need to say who they were. Their presence answered questions no one had bothered to ask earlier. The way they carried themselves. The way they scanned the room, not with confusion, but with awareness. It was the kind of awareness that comes from environments where details matter and hesitation costs something. The adults who had been so certain just moments earlier went quiet. The tone they'd been using evaporated. Someone straightened in their chair. Another cleared their throat. Authority, which had felt solid and unmovable, suddenly looked fragile. The confidence they'd used to corner a child didn't translate well when faced with someone who didn't need to prove anything. The girl didn't speak. She didn't have to. The truth was no longer something she needed to defend. It stood there on its own, filling the room in a way her words never could. The same adults who had demanded proof now avoided eye contact. Questions that had been sharp and relentless disappeared entirely. Introductions were made. but they sounded different now. Polite, careful. Names and titles were exchanged with an urgency that hadn't existed before. Someone apologized, not directly, not fully, but enough to acknowledge a shift. Another tried to laugh it off, as if the last several minutes could be reframed as a misunderstanding. The air felt tight, like everyone was suddenly aware of how exposed they were. Details emerged without needing to be forced. Quiet confirmations. A few clipped sentences. Enough to make it unmistakably clear that the girl had been telling the truth from the start. Not an exaggeration. Not a fantasy. Just a fact that hadn't fit their expectations. The realization moved through the room in waves. Embarrassment. Discomfort. Regret for some. Defensiveness for others. What stood out wasn't anger. It was restraint. The kind that comes from control, not fear. The person who had entered didn't raise their voice or demand explanations. They asked simple questions. Calm ones. The kind that don't sound threatening until you realize every answer matters. The adults stumbled through their responses, suddenly aware that their earlier certainty had left a trail. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Moments earlier, authority had been loud and dismissive. Now it was quiet and cautious. The same people who had spoken over a child now chose their words carefully. The imbalance of power they'd relied on was gone, replaced by something they couldn't redirect or dominate. The girl watched all of this without saying a word. Her role in the room had changed completely. She wasn't the subject anymore. She was the reason. The truth she'd been punished for was now the center of the conversation. No one asked her to repeat herself. No one questioned her tone. No one corrected her posture. She had become invisible again, but this time in a way that felt like relief. The room felt smaller, not because of pressure, but because of accountability. Every person there was suddenly aware of their own behavior. The jokes that had earned laughs earlier now sounded cruel in hindsight. The assumptions they'd made felt reckless. The lesson they'd tried to teach looked thin and misplaced. What froze them wasn't confrontation. It was clarity, the kind that strips away excuses and leaves only what actually happened. A child told the truth. Adults chose not to believe her. And now the truth was standing in front of them, undeniable, unbothered, and impossible to dismiss. The shift in power was immediate, even if no one wanted to admit it. You could feel it in the way people stopped leaning back in their chairs and started sitting upright, in the way voices lowered without being asked. The room that had felt controlled and confident just minutes earlier now felt cautious, like everyone was suddenly aware that the rules had changed and no one was sure who was in charge anymore. Before, power had been loud. It had spoken over a child. It had pointed fingers and issued warnings. It had relied on numbers, titles, and the comfort of knowing no one would challenge it. Now it didn't look like that at all. It looked uncertain. It hesitated. People who had been quick to speak now waited, measuring their words, glancing at one another for cues they no longer trusted. The adults who had taken control earlier were no longer directing the moment. They were reacting to it. Questions that once sounded accusatory now came out carefully phrased. Statements were softened. Someone repeated themselves, not because they wanted to be heard, but because they were trying to correct what they'd already said. The authority they'd worn so comfortably had slipped, and they were scrambling to adjust. Power didn't move because someone demanded it. It moved because the truth changed who everyone had to answer to. The girl was no longer the smallest presence in the room. She wasn't being watched or evaluated. She wasn't the one under pressure anymore. That weight had transferred, and it settled heavily on the people who had misused their positions. What made the shift so striking was how fast it happened. There was no debate, no argument, no need for proof beyond what was already standing there. All the confidence that had fueled their behavior collapsed under the realization that they had been wrong in public, and wrong in a way that couldn't be smoothed over with authority or rules. Body language told the story better than words ever could. Arms that had been crossed now hung at sides. Faces that had worn tight smiles went blank. Someone who had been standing moved to sit down without being asked. Another avoided the center of the room entirely, choosing a spot near the wall as if distance could soften accountability. The girl noticed it too, not with satisfaction, not with triumph, but with a quiet awareness that something fundamental had changed. The pressure that had made her chest tight began to lift. She didn't need to defend herself anymore. She didn't need to explain. The room had finally caught up to the truth she'd been carrying alone. Power shifted because credibility shifted. The adults had built their authority on the assumption that they knew better. When that assumption collapsed, so did the structure built on top of it. Their earlier certainty now worked against them. Every harsh word, every laugh, every public correction replayed silently in their minds, reframed through the knowledge that the girl had never been lying. No one announced an apology. No one formally acknowledged the transfer of control. But it was there in the pauses, in the careful pacing of the conversation, in the way no one interrupted anymore. The dominance that had once filled the room now felt risky. Speaking too boldly meant drawing attention to past behavior, and no one wanted that. What's important about moments like this is how revealing they are. Power didn't disappear. It just moved to the place it should have been all along. Away from intimidation and toward accountability. Away from volume and toward restraint. The people who had relied on authority as a shield now had to face the reality that it could just as easily expose them. The room hadn't become calm because everything was resolved. It became calm because everyone was suddenly aware of consequences. Not the kind written in policy books, but the kind that follow you when you realize your actions were seen clearly and can't be undone. That awareness changes behavior fast. The girl stayed quiet, and that silence carried more weight than anything she could have said earlier. It wasn't submission anymore. It was presence. She existed in the room without being questioned, corrected, or doubted. And that, more than any confrontation, made it clear who no longer held control and who never should have been challenged in the first place. The consequences didn't arrive with shouting or threats. They came quietly, in the way the room reorganized itself around what had just happened. People began to understand that this moment wasn't going to disappear when the door closed. What they had done was witnessed, remembered, and now connected to real accountability. The confidence they'd relied on earlier no longer protected them from what followed. Someone suggested taking a break, not for the girl, but for themselves. A pause to regroup, to figure out how to respond now that the situation had flipped. Phones came out. Messages were typed and deleted. The weight of documentation settled in. Names, times, behavior, all of it suddenly mattered. The same people who had dismissed the truth minutes earlier now looked worried about how the story would be told later. The consequences showed up first in language. Words like misunderstanding and miscommunication were tested, then quietly abandoned when they didn't hold up. Responsibility began to hover in the air, unspoken but unavoidable. Someone asked who had initiated the confrontation. Someone else asked why it hadn't been stopped sooner. These weren't questions meant to accuse, but they carried that effect anyway. For the adults involved, consequences didn't look like immediate punishment. They looked like exposure, like realizing their actions would be reviewed, not just by each other, but by people outside the room who wouldn't accept authority as an excuse. Policies that had been used earlier as weapons were now being reread carefully, this time with anxiety instead of confidence. The girl wasn't asked to stay. She wasn't asked to explain herself. That in itself was a consequence. The focus had shifted away from her entirely, leaving behind a silence where her humiliation had been. What remained was a mess that belonged solely to the people who had created it. They couldn't redirect it anymore. They couldn't pin it on a child. Later, consequences took shape in conversations that happened without her present. Closed doors. Serious tones. The kind of meetings that don't get scheduled unless something has gone wrong. People replayed the moment in their heads, not out of guilt alone, but out of fear of how it would look when repeated accurately. Laughter that once felt harmless now sounded cruel. Certainty that once felt justified now sounded reckless. Some consequences were internal. A few people couldn't stop thinking about the girl's face when they laughed. About how small she'd looked standing there alone. About how easy it had been to dismiss her. Those thoughts lingered, uncomfortable and persistent, challenging the version of themselves they preferred to believe in. Other consequences were practical. Reports had to be written. Explanations prepared. Questions answered. The incident didn't stay contained. Stories like this never do. They travel through emails, phone calls, and quiet warnings. Be careful. Watch your tone. Remember what happened last time. Authority learns slowly, but it learns best when reputation is on the line. What made these consequences different was that they couldn't be reframed as discipline gone right. There was no success story to point to, no lesson learned by the child. The only lesson was learned by the adults, and it wasn't flattering. They had acted without listening. They had relied on power instead of judgment. And now that behavior had a record. The girl's absence from the fallout was its own kind of justice. She didn't have to argue or demand anything. She didn't have to prove harm. The consequences existed because what happened was wrong, not because she insisted it was. That distinction mattered. It meant the situation stood on its own, undeniable. In the days that followed, behavior changed. Not dramatically, not publicly, but noticeably. People spoke more carefully to kids. They hesitated before correcting. They asked more questions, not out of kindness alone, but out of memory, out of knowing how fast a moment can turn and how hard it is to recover once it does. Consequences don't always look like punishment. Sometimes they look like restraint, like second-guessing yourself before speaking, like realizing that authority doesn't erase mistakes, it amplifies them. And once that realization takes hold, it doesn't fade quickly, especially for those who understood too late that the power they misused had finally answered back.